years ago, we started the journey through Genesis. So a couple of years ago, we started in Genesis 1, and we spent 15 weeks in the prologue. That's Genesis 1 through 11. And that prologue, the first 11 chapters in Genesis, are really foundational to the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible sits on that foundation in the first 11 chapters. So we worked through that section of Genesis. And then a year ago, we picked the book back up again, and we were in Genesis chapter 12. And we started several months just looking at the life of Abraham. That was last year. And now we are picking it up again, and we are now to Genesis chapter 23, and we are into the life now of Isaac and Jacob. That's where we are now. And for the next couple of months, we're just going to spend some time thinking about this part of the Bible together. So let me spend just a few minutes reorienting us to the book of Genesis. Like, where have we been? What have we been seeing in the book of Genesis? So if you flip back a few chapters to Genesis chapter 12, here's what you're going to find in Genesis 12. God makes a promise. And here's what the promise sounded like. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name, Abraham, I'm going to make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, if you want to sort of just group all the promises God is making down into three big promises, here are the three promises. God comes to Abraham and says, "Abraham, I am going to bless you." So that's one promise. A blessing from God. Now, blessing in the Bible is the favor of God on a person for a purpose. That's the blessing of God, the favor of God on a person for a purpose. And the blessing of God is directly connected to the presence of God. Not just like God is everywhere with everyone in kind of a generic sense, because God is everywhere, but it's God's covenantal witness. It's the way God is with his people. Blessing is connected to that. So later on, we're going to be in the life of Joseph. That'll be the next section of Genesis that we pick up. And if you think about the life of Joseph, he is falsely accused and thrown in prison. But there in prison, Joseph prospers. He's doing great in prison. He's got a great favor with all the prison guards. It is going well for him in prison. Now, why is that? Here's the Bible's answer to why he is prospering even in a dark place like prison. It is because God was with him, because God was blessing him. That's why. So God looks at Abraham and says, "Here is my promise to you, Abraham. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to be with you in such a way where you're going to prosper and do great. I'm going to bless you, Abraham." That's promise one. Promise two is a people. A people. So I'm going to bless you, blessing, and then a people. So he says to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, "I will make of you a great nation." Abraham, from you is not just going to come a person, like a child. No, from you is going to come a people. Not just a person, but a people. Now, this is even though Abraham and Sarah, they can't have kids. They are struggling with infertilities. Not only do they not have kids, they can't have kids. And God looks at them and promises peoples. A nation is going to come from you. He even says to Abraham at one point, "I want you to look up at the stars, Abraham. That's how many descendants you're going to have. Look at the sand on the seashore. That's how many descendants you're going to have, Abraham." Now, think about this. From the start, God is showing the sort of pattern he is going to instill inside of his promises. There is a pattern to the promises, and here's the pattern. God's promises will require more than human ingenuity. It's going to require more than what, Abraham and Sarah can just sort of figure out in their life. God's promises are actually going to require God's power. Abraham and Sarah can't just make a kid, right? They can't make, Sarah's womb fertile. They can't do anything. It's going to take the power of God to fulfill his promises. So to barren Abraham, God says nations are coming. from you. Kings are coming from you. The serpent crusher, Jesus himself, Abraham, is going to be coming from you. Abraham, this is what's happening. This is the promise I'm making to you. So there's the promise of blessing, there's the promise of a people, and then there's the promise of a place for God's people. A place. It's implicit in the first 3 verses of Genesis 12, but it's explicit when you get to verse 7. God says to Abraham, Abraham, to your offspring, I will give this land, the promised land. This is the land promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. Now, in the Old Testament, the promised land is the land of Canaan. But when you fast forward in the story, we know that the promised land is really the new heavens and the new earth. But when God restores everything and he comes down as the king and reigns here forever, that's what we have to look forward to. Now, let's back up from Genesis and just see it from kind of that zoomed out, that panoramic picture of this book. Here is a good way to think about what's happening in Genesis. Genesis is paragraph after paragraph of promise tracking. That's what's happening in Genesis. Chapter by chapter, story by story, we are tracking the promise that God made all the way back in Genesis 3:15 of a serpent crusher, all the way, that promise he made back in Genesis 12 to Abraham of a blessing, a people, and a place. The book of Genesis is tracking that promises story by story by story. Now, here is the question under every text, every chapter, every story in Genesis. It's this question: will God be faithful to his promise? Are the promises of God breakable? That's the question underneath every text. Under every story you read is that, because every story you read is presenting problems to the promise. So when you're reading the story, it's like, well, will famine break the promise of God? Like when famine shows up in Genesis 12, how is the promise of God going to square with this famine? Will family strife break the promises of God? Maybe it's the external threats, like there's these warring kings. Are they going to break the promise that God has made to Abraham? Will infertility break the promises of God? It's hard to be a father of a people when you can't father a son, right? So is infertility going to be the thing that breaks it? And here is the point of Genesis. Here is what Genesis is trying to do just over and over, story by story for you. This is the big idea in Genesis. It is to convince God's people that God's promises are invincible. God's promises are invincible. That's the point. The reason God's given us Genesis is to fill our hearts with fresh faith just in the dependability of God, the dependability of his promises, the trustworthiness of God, that the promises of God really are invincible. Every promise God makes to his people, even when that promise is besieged and threatened, even when that promise feels very improbable and like there's no way that promise is now possible in light of where things are. Genesis is written to say, no, even when they're besieged, even when they're threatened, the promises of God are unbreakable. They are invincible. Think about all the promises God's made to his people, that God has made to you. Genesis is written to his people then and his people now to say, those promises, they're coming true. Those promises are invincible. Now, we see that in our text today. So let's start in Genesis chapter 23. It starts like this in Genesis 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Then you skip to the last couple of verses. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were, listen to this phrase, were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Okay, now let's zoom out of this story, Genesis chapter 3, for a moment and ask the question, what is this text doing for us? Why is this story included in the narrative of Genesis? Well, here's the reason. There is a big problem facing the promise, right? God has promised Abraham a place for his people. So God has come and said, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, Abraham. This is going to be the place for my people. But here is the problem with that promise. There's people in the land of Canaan, and those people are not looking to leave. So how is this going to work? How is God going to give Abraham this land? And this text is showing us the first piece of the promised land that has become property of Abraham. So now, for the first time when you read this text and this narrative, we can say, okay, in the face of a million obstacles, a million problems, God's promise of a place for his people is being fulfilled. Abraham has a piece of the promised land. It's his. He bought it. He now owns this piece of the promised land. Again, Genesis is just trying to reconvince the readers then and the readers now, you and I, that the promises of God are invincible. I don't know what promise from God is hard for you to believe today, but this text is here to reconvince your heart today that you can depend on it, that you can push your life all the way in on the promises of God, that they're that dependable, that's trustworthy, that stable. Now, let's zoom into this text in Genesis. So that's the big picture view. The promises of God are invincible. But when we zoom into this text, what do we see this text showing us? Well, when you zoom in, here's what it's showing. It is showing us the last day of a long marriage. That's what we see in this text. In Genesis 23, we see Abraham and Sarah in the sweetness and wisdom of their old age. And here in our text, Sarah, she takes her last breath. The marriage is now over. And we see Abraham, her husband, weeping at her side. Even in her death, still caring for her as he's thinking about how am I going to bury her? Where am I going to bury her? It is the last day of a long marriage. And on that last day, we see a man still faithful to his wife. Even on that last day, still faithful to her. And here's what Genesis 23 is providing you and I. For everyone who is married, it is providing us a chance to think about the last day of our marriage. When's the last time you've thought about that day, the last day of your marriage? If you are married in the room and your spouse is sitting beside you, would you just go ahead and take the hand of your spouse? I just want you, as I'm talking for the next couple of minutes, just to hold the hand of your spouse as you're listening. Just take their hand there. We live in a culture that spends an inordinate amount of time and money and energy thinking about the first day of marriage. But at the same time, our culture spends almost no time and energy and money thinking about the last day of their marriage. Today, the average wedding cost, so this is 2024, the average wedding cost is around $35,000. That's just the average, just right there in the middle. Just kind of the average of all those weddings, $35,000. That's a lot of money on the first day of a marriage, isn't it? That's a lot of time and energy and effort. There's months and months of planning and preparation for the first day of marriage. There's a lot of time and energy there, right? Focused on, given to the first day of marriage. But how much time and energy and effort are we giving to think about that last day of marriage? We all know that how you start the race is not as important as how you finish the race. You can start the race stumbling. You can start the race really slow and you can still finish well. Right? We all know that how you start the race is not as important as how you finish the race. And we want a great last day, don't we? When's the last time you've thought about the last day of your marriage? You know, we don't know much about Abraham and Sarah's first day, but we do know a lot about their middle days. And there was a lot of misery in their middle days. At one point, Abraham gives Sarah to be in the harem of another man. Not once, but twice he does that. I don't know how you recover from that. I mean, what does that conversation sound like the next day after that one? I don't know. I don't know how you make it through that. That's a hard day. That's a day full of a lot of misery in a marriage. Abraham and Sarah, they struggled for years and years, decades with infertility. That's a lot of misery in the middle days of their marriage. Sarah troubles the trouble of their infertility when she convinces Abraham to use Hagar, one of their servants, to bear a child for them. And that one sin right there with Abraham and Sarah, that sin of trusting human ingenuity, what we can see, what we can do, rather than the power of God to fulfill his promise, that one sin right there in their life launched their family into strife and division and just all sorts of heartache. Like all marriages, their middle days had a lot of misery in it. Those middle days had hard days full of sin and grief, and those middle days needed a lot of repentance and a lot of forgiveness in them. But Abraham and Sarah made it to the last day, and they had a good last day of their marriage. Don't you want a good last day of your marriage? Don't you want that? I say this often to you, but my goals in life are really simple. I want to die one day loving Jesus. I want to die one day loving my bride, Laura, and I want to die one day loving Jesus' bride, the church. That's how I want to die, because if you die that way, it's a good last day. The last day of your marriage is going to be great if you can die like that. How often do you think about the last day of your marriage? To have a good last day of your marriage, you have to think about and invest in more than the first day of your marriage. You've got to invest into those middle days of your marriage. You've got to spend time and energy on your marriage. This is one of the reasons we do things like a discipleship conference focused on marriage. It is to help you invest into your marriage so that you can have a great last day of your marriage. Don't you want a great last day of the marriage? I know I sure want a great last day of our marriage. So if you would, you've taken the hand of your spouse, and it's going to be a little bit awkward, but I want you to just look at your spouse. Just look at them right there in the face. And would you say to your spouse sitting right there beside you, I'm going to be here on the last day. Yeah, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here. I'm in for having a great last day of our marriage. I'm praying that for you. I so want that for you. And I'm going to just take a moment. We're going to pause and let's pray for the marriages here, that we would have a great last day. So God, would you do that? God, would you protect marriages? God, would you sustain marriages? God, would you give wisdom and insight to husbands and wives in this room about how to keep their heart in your love? They just keep loving you. They keep loving one another. They keep loving your bride. God, would you help us do that, oh God? Because we want a great last day. God, would you get us to the finish line well? Would you get every one of our marriages to the finish line for a great last day, oh God? Would you do that? And it's in the good name of Jesus we ask it. Amen. That's Genesis 23. Now we're to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis 24 is the longest chapter in Genesis. It's the big boy in Genesis. It's got a lot to say here. And in Genesis 24, the promise of God, and in particular, the promise of a people. Like Abraham, you're going to have descendants and nations as numerous as the stars in the sky. That promise meets another problem. And here's the problem. Isaac, Abraham's miracle son, the son of his old age, his only begotten son, his son Isaac, has no wife. And we know that with no wife, there's no more life. You ain't having any more kids, right? So this promise has met a really significant problem. How is Abraham going to become a great nation if his kids can't have kids? If his kids don't have kids? So under Genesis chapter 24, just like under Genesis 23, is that question. Will God be faithful to his promise? Are the promises of God breakable? And just like the answer in Genesis 23 is, God's promises are invincible. That is the same answer that Genesis 24 shows us. God's promises are invincible, even in the face of human impossibility. The promises of God are unbreakable. Genesis 24 is really showing us this. It is showing us that God providentially guides everyday life to accomplish his promises. Just receive that from God today. God is providentially arranging the details of everyday life, your everyday life, to accomplish all of his promises to you. That's what Genesis chapter 24 is showing us. God does that by leading Abraham's servant to Rebekah, and then the chapter ends by showing us the first day of this new marriage between Isaac and Rebekah. The first day of a marriage. Genesis 23 is the last day of a marriage. Genesis 24, we see the first day of a marriage. And in Genesis chapter 24, we learn 5 things about the first day of a marriage, or really the lead up to that first day of a marriage. I just want to work through 5 things that we learn about the first day of marriage from Genesis 24. Here's the first thing. Genesis 24 shows us that Christians don't date in the dark. So we just talked to married folks in Genesis 23. Now we're talking to all of our single folks and those who are aspiring to marriage. This chapter is for you, Genesis 24. And the first thing we learn is Christians do not date in the dark. Okay, now when you get into the world of Genesis 24, you are into the world of arranged marriages. That's the world of Genesis 24. And there are upsides to arranged marriages. And let me give you the upside of arranged marriages. When parents are wise, they get to leverage their wisdom to find the right kind of spouse for their child. That's an upside. When parents are wise, you get that benefit. So now just watch how this happens in the text. Everyone in the text knows exactly what's going on. They know what the agenda is, right? Abraham knows what's going on. He's trying to find a wife for his son. The servant knows what's going on. We're trying to find a wife for Isaac, right? Everybody knows what's going on. The servant lets Rebekah know what's going on. The servant lets Rebekah's family know what's going on. Rebekah's dad knows what's happening here. Her brothers know what's happening here. Everybody in the text is in the know, right? Everybody is. Nothing is in the dark. Everything is in the light. Now, we do not live in the day of arranged marriages. We live in the day of dating. That's our day. And Genesis 24 has something we can learn in the day of dating, and here's what it is. We do not date in the dark. Christians do not date in the dark. They date in the light. Dating in the dark will always, you can just mark it down. Dating in the dark will always lead to damage. Always lead to damage. If you are dating right now and you're keeping your church community, your pastors, your parents in the dark about that person, you can count on it. It's going to lead to damage. If you're keeping people in the dark about how you're relating to that person, how you're interacting with that person, where physical kind of lines are right now in that relationship, and where temptation is right now in that if you're keeping people in the dark, you can just bet on it is going to lead to damage. But part of what we can learn from this text is we date in the light. Christians do not date in the dark. Dating in the dark will always lead to damage. Here's the second thing we learn from this text, is Christians date for marriage. For marriage. Now, notice Abraham's stated goal in this text. So this is in verses 3 and 4. Abraham says to his servant, he basically makes this guy swear an oath to him, right? A promise. And I am just grateful we live in the day of handshakes for promises, not like under thigh moments. In the world of Genesis 24, it's an under thigh moment. Today, it would be a handshake. But in this text, Abraham says to his servant, I want you to promise me. And here's what he wants him to promise him. That you will not take a wife, just note that phrase, not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but you will go to my country and to my kindred, and you will take a wife for my son Isaac. But I just want to clearly state the goal that Abraham has. It is to find Isaac a wife. That's the goal of the text. That's what he is doing in the text. And that is the goal of dating. That's what dating is for. Dating is for finding a husband, finding a wife. That's what dating is for. Now, let me just give you a definition of dating. Okay, let me just define it for you. Here's what dating is. Dating is pairing off with a person of the opposite gender for the sake of considering marriage. Okay, that's dating. And just notice that last part of the phrase. It is for the sake of something. It's got an end. It's got a purpose. It's for the sake of considering marriage. That's the reason that we date. That's the purpose. Right? That's the end goal of dating. So I am for dating like that, defined like that, for the sake of considering marriage. But here is what I'm against. I'm against what we might call recreational dating. Let me define recreational dating. Recreational dating is pairing off with a person of the opposite gender for the sake of nothing. That's recreational dating. It is pairing off with another person for no purpose, right? It's recreational dating is dating that is disconnected from the pursuit of marriage, from the goal of marriage, right? And I, just to say this clearly, it's like there's no biblical category for that way of relating to people. I'm going to be paired off with this person in an exclusive relationship, and marriage is not what this thing is about. It's not trending toward marriage. It's not aimed at marriage. The purpose is not marriage. The Bible has no category for that way of relating to people. So let me just talk to our young single ladies in the room. If you are dating a guy and he has no interest in marriage, you should look at that guy and say, it's over. It's over. You should not let him treat you that way. Here is what's happening in that moment. That guy is going to begin to take parts of you without giving all of himself to you, right? So you should look at him and say, it ain't happening anymore. It's either we're moving here or we're not, and we're done. And I'm going to find a person that will move there. Right? But if that's you, I want to just give you the freedom to you should look at him and say, no more of that. Now, let me talk to parents for a moment. If you've got maybe junior high kids, high school kids in your home, I have found that most parents have not thought this through. How dating in these years, what this ought to look like, how it kind of comes down into the junior high and high school years. So let me give you an illustration of what recreational dating is. Recreational dating is when two fourth graders pair off in an exclusive relationship. Now, here's what happens every time I say that. People do what you just did. They laugh without realizing how common that is. That is everywhere. Now, we could extrapolate that up now. We could just kind of bring the line up and say it's two seventh graders dating. Unless they're looking to get married in a couple of years, it's recreational dating. It's a couple of freshmen dating. Unless they're looking to get married in the next couple of years, it's recreational dating. It's dating. It's pairing off with someone of the opposite gender for no particular purpose. So unless you're connecting dating to the moment of marriage, we're in the recreational dating sort of theme and in that lane. And when you read the Bible, here is what you're going to find. It cuts directly across the grain of the Bible. Recreational dating is so common in our culture, but it's crazy to the Bible. Just imagine you reading 1 Corinthians 7, you're understanding the logic that Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 7, and then you come to him and say, but I'm going to encourage my junior high kids to date another person. Paul would be like, what? You're doing what? Like these junior high and high school years are years where Paul would say, your students, your kids could give undistracted devotion to Jesus, to the mission of Jesus. God, whatever you want, and I am free to love you and do whatever it is that you ask. And you're going to let your kids squander these years where they could be giving it to undistracted devotion to Jesus with recreational dating? Paul would look at you and be like, I don't see how this is matching here. Now, this is such an underdeveloped area in most parents that I've written a small article just to try to help you think it through a little bit. We're going to send that out to all of our church today. It's going to come in an email later today or a text, but you can get that. And I would just encourage you as parents to make sure you do thinking on that so you can start all of those conversations with your kids as early as possible, trying to cast vision for what these junior high and high school years can be with the Lord. here's what we learn. Christians don't date in the dark. Here's the second thing we learn. Christians date for marriage. Here's the third thing we learn. Christians marry Christians. Christians marry Christians. Now, Abraham is really emphatic about a few things in this text, right? He makes the promise, the under thigh promise. And here's the under thigh promise, right? It is that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. So these people that we're living with here, you can't be getting a wife here. Rather, you'll go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. So you're going to go over there to get a wife, but not these people. Now, what is going on in this text? Why is Abraham so emphatic that it's not going to be from these people, it's got to be from those people? What is this? Well, it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with faith. That's what's happening in this text. The Canaanites who are living around Abraham, they don't know Abraham's God. They are worshiping their own gods. They're worshiping false gods. And Abraham knows if Isaac marries one of them, he is in trouble. Compromise is going to be knocking at his door. He knows that it's going to be impossible for Isaac to love Jesus with his whole heart if he is married to a person who loves another God with their whole heart. It's going to be impossible for Isaac. He knows that it won't be long before Isaac is down on his face worshiping those false gods with these surrounding people. It has nothing to do with race and everything to do with faith. This is how Paul says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. He says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That's Paul's way of saying Christians marry Christians. Now, to all of our singles who desire marriage, okay, if you're in junior high, if you're high school, you're in your 20s, 30s, it doesn't matter what age you are. If you desire marriage and you're single, a person loving Jesus with their whole heart is the gate they have to walk through for you to consider them in marriage. We could say it this way. Missionary dating, like I'm going to date that person in hopes they'll love Jesus. Missionary dating is sinful dating. The gate they must walk through is, I love Jesus. I know Jesus. I'm a worshiper of Jesus. I'm an enjoyer of Jesus. That's the gate they have to walk through for you to consider them in marriage. I've been rereading the book that has probably been the most influential book outside the Bible that I've read in kind of my Christian formation. It's a book called Desiring God. And in the preface, John Piper is talking about his daughter. And she was 15 at the time when he wrote the preface to this book. And when he's talking about his daughter, he says, here was her motto. Here is her motto at 15 years old. So his daughter's 15. Here's her motto at 15 years old. A girl should get so lost in God that a guy has to seek him to find her. That's a good motto. That's a motto every single person ought to live by. I'm going to be so lost in God that to find me, they're going to have to seek him. That's the gate that a person has to walk through for you to consider them in marriage. Christians marry Christians. That's the principle. Number fourth thing we learn. It's not just that Christians marry Christians, but that Christians marry character. Christians marry character. When Abraham sends his servant, the essential, kind of quality that Abraham's looking for is faith. That this person loves the God of the Scriptures, right? That they believe that they are people of faith. Christians marry Christians. That's what Abraham is most concerned about. Lovers of Jesus, and this is true in the Bible, lovers of Jesus marry lovers of Jesus. But the servant adds something to Abraham's list. The servant adds character to the list. So we might could say it this way. Yes, Christians marry Christians with a deep, rich, well-formed character. That's who we marry. Christians with a deep, rich, well-formed character. Now you see this in the prayer that the servant prays. So he makes his way to the city of Nahor, and he's there, and then he prays, and he says, okay, God, I'm looking, for Isaac's wife here. So here's going to be my ask. I am going to wait by this well, and then when the ladies come out, I'm going to ask the question, can I have some water? And I'm going to take it as from you that the way you're going to show me which girl is for Isaac, what woman we're going to take back with us here. I'm going to take it as from you that it's going to be the woman that says, of course I'll give you some water, and I'm going to water your camels too. That's going to be the gal. Now, why is that? Well, it's because that was no small job. Do you know how much water a camel can drink? If you say yes, you would be a really weird person, all right? 30 gallons. That's how much. You know how many camels there are in this text? 10. That's 300 gallons of water that's going to be needed. She is likely carrying a 5-gallon jar. So that means she is saying yes to 60 trips downstairs into a well, drawing water, 5 gallons, up those stairs into a trough, down those stairs, up those stairs, down those stairs, up those stairs, 60 times down and up to feed those camels. This is the type of woman the servant wanted for Isaac. The servant wanted a servant, a person of deep, rich, well-worn, well-formed character. Christians marry character. If you are single, desiring marriage, I am not saying that outward appearance is nothing. Okay, it's something. I'm not saying it's nothing. But here is what I am saying. That what is on the outside has a place, it's just not first place. It's not nearly as important as our culture is discipling us to believe. It's not nearly that important. Maybe we could think about it this way. What's on the outside will have almost no importance, no significance, no value on the last day of your marriage. If you want a great last day, outward appearance is not the main thing you need to be looking for. Right? When a person on the last day, when a husband on the last day looks at his wife and says, "You are beautiful. You are beautiful." If he says that on the last day, it's not because she looks great in a swimsuit. That's not the reason. Here is why. It's because something deeper, richer, and more robust has become beautiful to him. It is because he has developed eyes to see the beauty of a deep, rich, well-formed character. That's why the guy on the last day says that. There's a reason why wisdom says in Proverbs 31:30 that charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Christians marry Christians with a deep, rich, well-formed character. If you are desiring to be married, I just want to plead with you, wait for a person with that kind of character. Wait for that person. Number 5, we learn that Christians pursue marriage. Christians pursue marriage. We live in just a cultural moment that has devalued the dignity of marriage. We just devalue it. There are more people living without a spouse today than ever before in history in America. So right now, that's the cultural kind of ethos we're in. Now, why is that true? Why are there more people living without a spouse today than ever before? I think it's because our culture disciples us to believe like this: what I want for my life is more important than what I want for our life. So what I want, my freedoms, the things I want to accomplish, the things I want to do, those are all more important than what I want for us. What I want for my life is more important than what I want for our life. But when you step into the world of the Bible, we begin to see life through a different lens. It's the opposite lens. In the Bible, it is what I want for our life that is more important than what I want for my life. That's the world of the Bible. This is, by the way, one of the many reasons we read the Bible, because it helps us see the world and feel about the world like Jesus sees and feels. That's why we read the scriptures, because our culture is distorting us and deforming us to feel and see things differently. And here's how the Bible sees it. What I want for our life is more important than what I want for my life. Marriage is a huge deal in the Bible. It's not just one theme among many themes in the Bible. It's the wraparound theme. You see it, the institution of it start in Genesis chapter 2, and then you see it at the end of the Bible in Revelation 21 and 22, where we've got the wedding between God and his people. Right? You've got it. It's the wraparound theme, not one among many, but the wraparound theme. It is a massive thing in the Bible. And in Genesis 2, we see God creating marriage. Marriage is one mortal life fully shared between one man and one woman. God creates marriage in Genesis 2, and then God gifts that thing to us. Marriage, he gifts it to us. And it ought to be pursued and valued and honored by Christians. In our text, this servant walks 450 miles one way to find a wife for Isaac. That's pursuing marriage, isn't it? That's some hard work to go get marriage, right? He is valuing 450 miles one way for the sake of finding Isaac a wife. Now, some might say, but what about Paul in 1 Corinthians 7? Doesn't Paul value the single life over a married life? Isn't that what we see in 1 Corinthians 7? Well, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul definitely lifts up the value and dignity of a single life given to Jesus and the mission of Jesus with undistracted devotion. Paul looks at that and says, that is amazing. He gives dignity and honor to the single life given to Jesus with that sort of devotion. But in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is not trying to replace the gift of marriage with the gift of singleness. He's not trying to replace marriage. Christians pursue marriage. But let me take it even a step further. Christians don't wait forever to pursue marriage. We don't wait forever to do that. The median age right now in our culture for men to get married is over 30. That's the median age when men get married. For ladies, it's over 28. And it would be one thing if men in their 20s were saying, you know why I'm not married? It is because I'm giving this decade undistracted devotion to Jesus. I'm just giving this decade to him, to take the gospel to the unreached places of the world, to risk everything, to push all my life in for that. That's what I'm doing. It'd be one thing if that were true, but that's not what's going on. Most of the time, what is going on is my life has become more important than our life. What I want is more important than marriage. And that ought not be for Christians. So to our young men, let me just encourage you like this. Think about the biblical language that's deployed to talk about marriage. In the Bible, you even see it in our text today. A man takes a wife. That's the language the Bible uses. A woman is given in marriage. Right? This is the language you're going to find throughout the scriptures. One is very proactive. There's a taking. One is more passive. It's a giving in marriage. And that language does shed light on God's design for how these things ought to work, how these things should function. So to our young men, I want to just look at you in the eye. If you're in your 20s, I want to look at you in the eye and say, you should pursue marriage. You should be becoming the type of person that can become responsible for someone else, and then you should pursue marriage, like proactively pursue it. You should do that. That means you have to get over your fears. That means you have to develop some resilience to take some rejection along the way, and you should look at that girl and you should ask her out. Not tomorrow. You should ask her out today. So to all of our young single, I just want to encourage you toward that. For our young men, you should be about that work, right? There you go. Okay, so let me finish here. Like every text in the Bible, Genesis 24 points us to Jesus. So let me retell the story of Genesis 24, and you tell me if this story doesn't sound familiar. A father seeking to elect a bride for his only begotten son sends out his servant to go and get her. He compels her by grace through faith to go and receive him, the only begotten son, as her groom. Then he clothes her in riches and grafts her into his eternal promises for the rest of her days. Does that story sound familiar? That is not just the story of our text. That is the story of redemption. We are a people who were far off, who have been elected by God from eternity past. And God, at just the right time, sent his servant, the Holy Spirit, to open our eyes so that we could see Jesus, to open our hearts so that we could believe in Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, who has been patiently waiting for us. And then once received, Jesus takes us up in his arms, and he has given us the jewels of his perfect life, death, and resurrection. He's given us new clothes to wear, and he's grafted us into the beautiful, the enduring promises of God for the rest of our days. Friends, that is our story. That's our story. Genesis 24 is a beautiful love story, but it points us to the most beautiful love story. And that's a story that you're invited into to enjoy for the rest of your days. Would you bow with me? Let me give you just a moment to allow the Spirit of God to press into you what would be most helpful, to wipe away the things that wouldn't be, and if you're not a part, haven't entered into, haven't yet enjoyed the most beautiful love story, then this is your day. Just there where you are, just your heart and the language it knows can cry out to the Lord, saying, I'm trusting in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Here I am, save me. And God stands ready to do that, right now to do that. So call out to him. And friends, if you're married in the room, let's prepare for a great last day. A great last day. And if this is your first day, if you're looking at that first day, aspiring to that first day, let's be faithful in the waiting. So God, would you help us? Would you help us? And it's in the good name of Jesus that we ask it. Amen.